Hi, my name is Greg Canty, and I'd like to welcome you to the Win Happy podcast. I love chatting to people from all walks of life about their lives and their careers, about the choices they make along the way to pursue their happiness, and what winning actually means to them. I hope you enjoy these conversations as much as I do. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I chat with Paul Kearns, journalist and urban planner from his home in Tel Aviv in Israel, just 60 kilometres from Gaza. Paul is living there with his two young daughters and his partner, and he's been there since 2018. He shares in detail the perspective of life there, how it has changed considerably since October the 7th, 2023, how it is for him and his family, how it is for his neighbours, friends and Israelis in general. He talks about the censorship by the media when reporting about the atrocities in Gaza, the awkward relationship Israel has now with Ireland, and why he has taken it upon himself to write about the conflict and pull back the curtains on the real stories. As an expert in urban planning and urban beauty, I ask him how he can possibly continue to live there and how this conflict can be resolved. Let's hear from Paul. Paul Kearns, a huge welcome back to the Win Happy podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you, Greg. I'm doing good.
So the last time we spoke, it was about a very important topic, and we were in the middle of COVID, and you had done an awful lot of work around Dublin and city planning, and you'd written an article that I spotted on the Irish Times about, what Dublin looks like when the tide goes out, and it was how a city looked when it was naked in a way, and we had a really interesting discussion, and that was the big topic at the time. That was the big topic. But of course, our conversation today, that topic doesn't even stand up alongside what we're about to talk about. October the 6th, 2023. Can you describe your life?
Well, I was living in Tel Aviv. I had two children, and my sister, who hadn't visited me in Tel Aviv up to that point, decided to come over for a week. She arrived over on October the 3rd for a week, and we had been to Jerusalem and we'd seen sights, etc. And on the morning of October the 7th, early, all of a sudden we start hearing the sirens. Now, I've heard the sirens of rocket attacks coming in to Tel Aviv before. She hadn't, obviously. And, I turned to my partner, Maddie, and said, oh gosh, something has happened. And this was quite early, maybe 6, 7 in the morning. And of course, we hadn't realized, or didn't realize until the hours unfolded, what had happened that day. And obviously days afterwards. And for her, luckily, she stayed very calm. She managed to leave the country about 3 days later, because all the flights were cancelled, but El Al flights continued to fly. And for some strange reason, she chose El Al, and she managed to get out of the country. And and we all know the rest since October the 7th.
For the world and for so many people, but I can imagine if you were living there, that was September the 11th, with a multiplier around it, I'm sure, for Israelis.
That date is invoked. The comparisons, they're not unreasonable. I think maybe what can get missed in terms of, no analogy or no comparison is perfect, but what can often get missed from that one is not so much the numbers, but the geography. Israel is small, and Israel proper, I think, is smaller than the size of Munster, and the distances, from different cities are extraordinarily small. The center of Tel Aviv is 60 kilometers away from Gaza, and so when the news unfolded in those first few hours, particularly around the issue of had Israel lost control of considerable territory. That was possibly more scary than the sirens. Maybe people don't recall, but Hamas and other groups, they had infiltrated up to 20 kilometers inside Israel. And Israel, at its narrowest point, in terms of its width, is just 15 or 18 kilometers wide, which is, for Irish listeners, I looked it up actually recently, it's narrower in terms of its width than the Beara Peninsula, or the length of Inishmore. So geography is tiny here. So there was reports that maybe armed groups had gone up the motorway and were heading to Tel Aviv. So you had that expectation in the first day or two. And of course, the sirens and the rockets were pretty intense for weeks, on and off, I guess, for months after that.
So the feeling was, this is just the beginning of something. More is coming. More is on the way.
Well, the numbers of those who were murdered on that day became pretty clear within a few, maybe days. But yeah, I think the whole issue of uncertainty about what was happening or what could happen, what was a big factor. And I think over time, as various other war fronts, so to speak, opened up, there was always that sense of genuine existential fear, especially when the rockets came in from Iran, and then the rockets came in from Yemen, and also in the north of Israel, they were, badly affected from Hezbollah. As I said, the country is small, so that sense of impending doom or danger from multiple directions, it was real.
How long are you there now?
I'm here, well, I shouldn't say permanently, because in this crazy place, you never know when you might have to leave. Since 2018.
Okay.
So that's, 7 years or so.
So since 2018, how many times have you thought to yourself, I'm out of here?
Well, since October the 7th, quite a few times, for many different reasons, many different reasons. We have two kids, the age of 2 and 8. And so you're looking at them and thinking of the future. And then the reality of, their experiences. You can only shelter them so much from news. You can't shelter them from the noise of sirens and running to bomb shelters. And it's, it's traumatizing. But, the politics of Israel, the direction of the country is going, its demography, it's not good. And so you have in the back of your mind, is it a good place for them to be in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time?
And you mentioned your kids. Is it a boy and a girl, or
two girls? Two
girls. Okay. Yeah. So has it had an effect on them?
Well, they're interesting ages. The 2-year-old is talking now, but she wasn't talking much at all, I think, when the war broke out. But you can see that she is afraid of noise, like if something in the distance of a boom or a bang or a construction or something, she'll jump into your arms. And the sirens, continued on since October the 7th. I mean, they only really ended, I think, a few weeks before the ceasefire. Particularly, there was rockets coming in from Yemen at night, occasionally. And so you wake up and it's deafening, it's absolutely deafening. The whole country is wired into this system for loudspeakers. And you jump when you hear it, and then you have to run downstairs to the collective war room, so it's that's in her consciousness. Whether, she'll remember as time goes on, I don't know. The 8-year-old, it's very, very different. You get really difficult and interesting questions. You protect her from the news, but you can't protect her from what other people say or what her schoolmates might say. So she asks very insightful questions, and you have to be, no matter how much experience you have or the expectation that these questions will come, they can catch you, and you have to be really careful about what you say or how you say it, and what political message you're communicating. And some of the questions are darned political, like they're hardcore political.
So go on, give me an example of some of them.
We were going to school one morning about a year ago, and there was a young soldier. I think I wrote about this on front of us, a female soldier, and it just couldn't escape your eyes because the female soldier she looked 15. She had to be a minimum of 18. But she's walking in front of us in the khaki uniform with, the big gun rifle slung over her shoulder. And I felt I had to address it. And I said, would you like to be a soldier? And immediately she said, no. And I said, why? And she said, because all the soldiers die. I said, well, they don't all die. And then you're beginning to struggle, and you say, some of them do this, some of them do this, and some of them do that. And there's cooks and there's graphic designers and there's programmers, and, that not everybody is in the front. So she asked me, so were you a soldier in Ireland? And I said, no. I said, we don't have no disrespect to the Irish Army, but I said, we don't have a big army. I said, I wasn't, no. And she's asked me then, so I can't remember her exact words. She says, who protects you when the enemies come in to try to kill you? And I, said something I can hardly recall, that we didn't have those threats, or that wasn't the situation in Ireland when I was a kid or now. And she's been to Ireland 8 times and she's only 8, so she wants to move there, and for obvious reasons. She sees things and hears things,
Yeah.
about the reality around her.
And Paul, you and your partner, is he from there?
He's from Tel Aviv, yeah.
Okay. Has he been to Ireland?
Well, he lived in Ireland many years.
Okay.
Yeah, he worked in Dublin as an architect.
Yeah.
We lived between Tel Aviv and Dublin for the best part of 15 years. So,
yeah, I'm kind of giggling here to myself, and I'm thinking, what in the name of God are those two with their 2 beautiful kids? What in the name of God are you doing in that place? What does it hold for you?
It's a good question. Well, right now it's home. I'll be frank, I like Tel Aviv. I like it a lot. It's an amazing city. It's a wonderful city. And without being too superficial about things, there's a wonderful climate and wonderful food, and the Mediterranean beach is beside you. And strange enough, with 2 kids, and as one gets older, the health service is just, everything is free and available, and just, amazing for me as an Irish person, even though I was, had private health insurance in Ireland. So, never say never, in terms of not returning. But that has even got complicated by, I wrote before, because I've been writing about the war for the last year and a half, and it's been a great privilege to do it, and it's an interesting challenge as an Irish person with, let me say, would share the common Irish perspective on the last year and a half of war and the destruction of Gaza and the tens of thousands who have been killed. It's since October the 7th, and pretty early after October the 7th, to be fair, the level of hate directed towards Israelis. The rise of anti-Semitism is one thing, but the level of, visceral hate against, the word Israeli, the person who is Israeli. I fear a little bit bringing 2 young daughters back to Ireland and exposing them to the risk. Would they hear something every day? I don't know. Is once a week enough? Probably. Do you read stories about fellow Israelis in Ireland, and pretty grim stories. Yeah. See, you're strangely juggling their physical safety here, the future of them as girls in a country that is not going in a good direction politically because of the demographic rise of the religious right. Like I'm saying, shall we return? And I could probably say hand in heart. In 20 years' time, Israel will not be probably a good place to live as a gay couple and for young girls or young women. But you have these things constantly in your mind. What would it be like in Dublin in the current climate?
And you're not talking weather.
I'm not talking weather, no. But it's a strange factor in your head. But I'm being silly in some degree. But Israel gives a quality of life to Israelis, for sure. And Tel Aviv, as I said, is a wonderful city. Yeah, there are big questions, and you really do think about them every second or third day. You think, what's the right thing for them?
It's been such a divisive topic. There's so many good pals that I've connected with down through the years, living all over the world, and for the most part, regardless of what they put out on LinkedIn or Twitter, you find yourself on the same side as them, and you're quite happy to retweet whatever they're saying or reply to them or share something on LinkedIn. Suddenly, when it came to October the 7th and everything that happened after, you found yourself in a really, really difficult situation with the things that they were saying. And, wow. I'm not going to automatically retweet what my buddy said there because I think I really disagree with him and they're not seeing both sides of it. You were talking about the current climate. Like, Trump is divisive. I barely talk to my brother anymore. He's in America, and the minute we have that conversation, it just goes south very, very quickly. But when it comes to Israel and Palestine, my God Almighty, such a divisive topic. That is Ireland in a very, very peculiar place compared to other parts of the world, I would say. The curve of the story from the 7th of October, it was clearly mass murder by Hamas. Every bit of sympathy that the whole world could give to Israel was there. And that story curved then, and it continued to curve since. But I think it curved in a different way for some parts of the rest of the world as it did in Israel. And you in particular were very vocal in that and what was being consumed in Israel. Can you talk about that and why you decided to put your head above the parapet? Because for someone in Ireland to give that opinion, yeah, I would say fair enough. But for someone actually living in Tel Aviv to say some of the things that you were saying quite bravely in media, now maybe that was none of your pals were ever going to see that, I'm not sure. Could you chat to me about that?
Well, I had written before when I came here first in 2002 to 2003, the second Intifada. Seemingly every time I arrive to live for a year or two, the worst happens, or maybe I'm just imagining it. But I wrote for the Sunday Tribune then a weekly column about during the second Intifada when buses were being blown up. Of course, two things very different about that whole experience. One, I didn't have children, and two, it didn't have despite the horror of what happened then. It wasn't as divisive. First of all, there was huge empathy to Israelis when restaurants and bombs were being blown up. And of course, horrible things were happening in the West Bank, etc. But it seemed to be packaged at that time as, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, terrible things are happening. The last year and a half, I felt compelled in the first week or two to write something down. And so I sent off an article or two to a couple of Irish newspapers because there was an immediate sense, I felt that the trauma, the impact of October the 7th was been lost quickly. And it's not so much that the focus, rightly so, turned quickly to the horror of the IDF's campaign on Gaza and the level of destruction and the number of deaths, which I think had reached almost 15 or 20,000 by January 2024. There was a sense, and Israelis feel this very, very strongly, that within, days, October the 7th was being diminished, or the impact on the psyche. I can say a year and a half later, I still can't say loud enough or write long enough about the long-term impact on the psyche of Israelis on October the 7th. It has profoundly changed the country in a way that I think, will determine its politics for decades, and not in a good way. And so I felt, compelled to tell something more about that. But then, of course, as time went on, the level of destruction was visible on our screens, your screens, and, my screen in terms of CNN or Al Jazeera or something. This was invisible on Israeli nightly news. And that became a kind of a big issue for me in terms of a narrative, to tell that again and again and again. I was also very conscious. I'm of a certain age, I'm not in my 30s, and the kids are young, but I was leaving something for them to read sometime in the future about what had happened now, because history can be written in strange ways, a decade after the event. And the truth is, Israelis do not see the level of horror that is inflicted on Gaza by the Israeli state and the Israeli army in their name. Now, there are just so many reasons, why they don't. But the reality is they don't. And that fact alone has just hugely impacted on their understanding of what they're in. And so the recent drip release of the hostages, and particularly the harrowing story of the two Ibas kids who are 4 and 9 months old, there was empathy. I could see there was a level of empathy elsewhere, particularly in, comments underneath newspapers can be at times pretty polarizing and sometimes, grim and offensive. But there was empathy there. So I think in my last article, I actually asked very close friends, parents outside the school, how do they feel emotionally about the return of the bodies of the two children who really became icons in the imagery of their faces with their red hair for a year and a half. But also to ask them, did they reflect, or was it a moment that they thought they might reflect on the level of dead children in Gaza? And, people were very honest. Most people's reaction was no. It's shocking to hear that. And I'm talking about left-wing Tel Avivians, it's a left-leaning city. It's viscerally anti-Netanyahu. I mean, half the country can't stand Netanyahu, and 80% of Tel Aviv would vote against the government. It's an eye-opener to hear or to listen to see that reaction. That almost a coldness in people's hearts about the level of destruction in Gaza and the level of deaths. Yeah, the emotions around it are extraordinarily deep and real. And I do think a big factor in that is they just haven't seen the images. And so people ask me, well, how come they don't see the images? And, since October the 7th, Israeli news is, a few different news channels, and they're pretty independent of the government. In fact, the state broadcaster, the equivalent of RT, is actually quite critical of the government. And they would have wall-to-wall 6 p.m. till 9 p.m. coverage of the war every day. And you would not see one image of the images that Irish people had see or saw for a year and a half of, those visceral, distressing images of dead children in the hands of parents, wrapped in cloth, amputees, you do not see it. The worst thing you might see is a kind of a apocalyptic image of a certain level of destruction, but there would not be any people in it. So there's a bubble that they live in, and a bubble of fierce anxiety about how the rest of the world not much so much sees them, a sense of under siege and under attack. And the stories of anti-Semitism are real all over the world, and a sense of being under siege. And that's, I don't know when or if ever, the average Israeli will see those images. There's no censorship. Al Jazeera was banned, but I think it was just a political football gamesmanship thing. The left-leaning Haaretz, the kind of paper of record of Israel, will be very, very critical of the government, and also would have, a journalist from a very left perspective. So there's a relatively robust debate, but the imagery is not there.
And it's impossible then to expect, your average, everyday Israeli trying to get on with their lives to process anything without having all of that, just proper information. I'm sure people like yourselves, parents with young kids watching this stuff, of course it would move you. Of course it would move you. We're getting that distorted reality everywhere, I think, with media, which is fairly bonkers in 2025. And this idea that people can start bending the truth and just put out a different story there because you choose to. Like our good buddy Donald suddenly saying Zelensky is a traitor and Ukraine started the war. Like I mentioned my brother getting into some of that stuff. Wow, it's impossible to have a conversation because there is a news channel that's pumping a different version of the truth to you all of the time. And that's what you end up consuming. But again, your friends, would people be aware within your circles that you've committed this to writing? Or is that something you just keep to yourself? Is that something to help us to understand on this side of the world?
No, I shared. I send it to them.
Okay.
They're fluent in English. I send to them on a regular basis, or I post it, so they would know what I'm writing. And it's a responsibility because I'm an Israeli citizen now, and I'm wearing 2 Jewish Israeli kids. So I'm navigating that space between. Let's just say there's no one Israeli, as there is no one Irish person to do on anything, let alone this issue. But the Irish response, and in particular, maybe some of the more challenging, maybe I'm being delicate here, maybe some comments by certain political figures, or even at times in journalism, that might be perceived as, will be perceived in Israel as not just anti-Israeli, but anti-Semitic. The status of Ireland is peculiar here. While, people are very aware of opinion in Ireland, and it seems to pop up in the news all the time, they're also, conscious that Ireland has no huge role in the Middle East and as a player. But the stories, they do percolate, or they do get through. And they can be odd and they can be strange. And people ask me all the time, genuinely looking for explanations as to, was it necessary to say this, or was it necessary to say that? And for me personally, it's a huge amount of material, strangely enough, because I think if I was from Finland or Portugal, I wouldn't be writing these. I wouldn't have that access to communicate this story, because in some ways, the Irish perspective is sort of emblematic of a certain perspective that's out there. And obviously the Israeli perspective is a perspective, and how they interact have become so polarized. I have this strange job of trying to navigate a little bit. So to get back to your question, I send it for me. I give them. Do they comment on it? Not always. Do they welcome it? I don't know.
Do you still get invited to the parties? Maybe we won't invite that fella next time.
Well, with two kids. Well, it's strange. I did feel both here and in Ireland, after October the 7th, I had very close friends in Ireland without a word. Now, I don't mean like, December, January, February, within days of October the 7th, which is so extraordinary, cut off all communication with me and haven't had any communication with me since.
Wow.
Yeah, more than one.
That's very odd.
Yeah. And it's not a response to the horror of what was unleashed in Gaza, because it happened within a week or so, which was kind of extraordinary. Equally, I'd have people here or friends here who maybe had to process what happened and took a back seat because maybe they might have expectations of what you're thinking.
Would people in your circle, because they know you're Irish, would they ask you to explain? What are the Irish lot up to here? Like, have you been asked to account for what they believe is wrong opinions or whatever, or some of the more extreme things that have been said?
Yes, all the time. All the time. You get that from strangers when they hear that you're Irish for the first time. I wrote as well before that, every Irish person, when they're abroad, can get this kind of, this nice fuzzy feeling when people will discover you're from, let's be honest, when they ask you where you're from and you don't say United States of America, you don't say United Kingdom, and you say Ireland, they're going, there's a warmth and a niceness and a generosity and a curiosity that you get. Now, I wouldn't say I get, I haven't got any kind of, overtly hostile but you get an immediate, okay, you guys don't like us, this type of thing, and they would look for explanations. And, most people are pretty well informed. I would throw the question back and say, why do you think Irish people have that attitude? And they would actually mention about, colonialism and, the link, between the occupation. They would be upfront about that. And, in my circle or in Tel Aviv, most people will be left voting. I don't know what that means now, but they were. And so they wouldn't be uncomfortable about things like the occupied West Bank and the occupation, etc. So they would have that knowledge, but it's some of the, maybe the funny is not the right word, but the kind of more peculiar things that would break through. And, there's a few, but break through easily because one might suggest, or one could say, that the Israeli media have understandably a very acute radar to perceived anti-Semitism. And so anything that happens anywhere, that it gets into the news. Or, anti-Semitism, maybe another phrase would be just an unusually weird or hostile attitude to Israel. So from the very beginning, the comments of the Taoiseach Leah Varadkar when Emily Hand was released by Hamas after 50 days, that she was a child lost that was found. And the explanation that was some biblical reference, But the idea that somehow her release by Hamas after being abducted from her home in the kibbutz after 50 days was described as a child is lost and now is found, just stunned Israelis. And so you have these, what might appear very innocuous, phrases that Israelis believe are incomprehensible why you would go that route. And as I have written myself many times, the occupation is bad enough. The brutality of the occupation is bad enough. The 7,000 dead Gazans is bad enough. 15,000 children killed. 80% of buildings destroyed or uninhabitable. The risk of disease, starvation, they're all so horrendous and unimaginable as topics and subjects. Why is it Israelis feel, and sometimes I actually feel the same, what is it in the need of certain Irish journalists and politicians to go in strange directions with their words, or to accuse maybe Israel of doing something that is just factually not true. And so there's an awareness, without naming names, but well, I name a name. It's up to you whether you want to include the name. But Richard Boyd Barrett of People Before Prophets, when his use of the word filthy. Filthy. A filthy Jew is an anti-Semitic trope. I think there's a scene in Schindler's List where one of the little German girls shouts at the girl in the red jacket, "Filthy Jew, go away," or whatever. There's so many wrongs, here committed by the Israeli state, but I don't know why the word filthy was necessary to say. And so there are many examples like that, the power of an argument is lost and something else pops up,
We started off talking about COVID, and in Ireland, COVID was never politicised in any way. All the different political parties got on board. But with the recent elections, the likes of Richard Boyd Barrett, People Before Profit, and even Sinn Féin, I think the timing was a bit misfortunate, and there was a lot of politicising of Israel and Palestine, and that the Irish government weren't doing enough and weren't being outspoken enough about the atrocities and everything. And I do think it was politicised. And I think a lot of what you heard there was for effect in an Irish context for voters, I think, more than an external audience. But obviously it was picked up. But there's no excusing that language. But I do think it was politicised here. And maybe that might have been fully understood. I was in a taxi just 2 weeks ago. My son, we're talking about children, he had his first movie being premiered at the Berlin Alley Film Festival. A lovely movie, called Christie. So if you can imagine, we come into the airport and it's a big deal. And the taxi driver, they're more like mini chauffeurs or whatever, picked you up in the really nice car because we were with one of the film directors and we were getting the VIP treatment. So myself and my other half T were in the car listening to this guy, and I don't think he was a taxi driver as such. He said he was a journalist. He was living in Munich, and he loved volunteering as a driver during these festivals because he loved movies and everything else. So all the chit-chat, your son is a director, that's lovely. And he started telling us that the previous day, there were two movie makers from the States they were in because they had done some film stroke documentary about October 7th. Boom. And straight away, he was, what's the deal with Ireland? And even though we were, I suppose, guests of the film festival, he started getting stuck on us about the Irish opinion. And I thought, gee, Christ almighty, that was taking a huge liberty. He couldn't understand at all what was coming out of Ireland. I went straight down the middle and just said, this is terrible on all sides. What I think the most terrible thing is what's going to come next. You mentioned your daughters, 2 and 8. You can imagine the people in Gaza who've survived, all of those young children who have witnessed that. And the impact on any of them, we can't even comprehend. But I'm guessing there can't be any peace for the people who've witnessed this, just like what we saw in Northern Ireland and everything else. The deep wounds of this are going to go on for so long. How is this going to evolve, Paul? Your kids in Gaza. What's going to happen to those generations of young children, young people, young adults coming into the world with that backdrop?
I think it's a recognition, in Israel, that the level of destruction, the deaths, the injuries, the memory, the trauma for Gaza children will feed into the politics of this region for decades. And again, not in a good way. And, I've been optimistic in the past about a two-state solution. I don't know. I really don't know anymore what in the immediate or medium-term horizon, what the political options are. in the context of what has happened and how, both Israeli and Palestinian society in their own way have been traumatized by the last year and a half. What, ultimately, any observer on the ground of the reality of Israel-Palestine still clings to the belief that a two-state solution is the only solution. And there's a couple of lies about that. And some are more, negative or positive from your perspective. There has been a lie peddled, I think, that given the level of Israeli settlements, that the two-state solution is just not viable. The facts on the ground, that's not quite true. 80% of 90% of Israeli settlers could be incorporated into Israel for small, without going into the weeds, taking out a small portion of the West Bank, etc. The real challenge, I think, is leadership. And, it sounds facile, but on both sides, to tell people the truth, that if two peoples are to exist side by side, this is the only solution. And perhaps, a certain cohort of Palestinian society clings to a different vision. Israelis are not slow to try tell the story that the two states was offered once in 2000 and once in 2008 by Barak in 2000 and by Olmert in 2008, whereby 95% of the West Bank was offered. And it was rejected both times. We can go into the weeds again, or other people can go into the history on the details of that. But the reality is 95% of the West Bank was offered and it was rejected. I can't see that being offered again in the current Israeli political context, given that, the West Bank is, as I said, 10, 15 kilometers from Tel Aviv, and the fear that now exists in Israeli society about what could happen again, like October the 7th. But also in terms of the demography, Israeli society is becoming more right-wing and more religious, purely on a head numbers count, the amount of Orthodox children, their families are having 7, 8, 9, 10 kids. They were like 2% of the population. Now they're like 12, 14. Something like 30% of kids under the age of 5 now are Haredim. It's a kind of a doomsday scenario demography-wise in terms of the politics of Israel. And then the leadership on the Israeli side in terms of, even the centrist, if you can call it that, opposition, is not hopeful. Leaving aside Netanyahu like Trump, eventually they disappear. It's very difficult for the center-left, you could call it that, opposition in Israel to articulate a two-state solution now. It's very difficult, but it needs to be done. And my fear, of course, is, when Trump unleashed his crazy plan for the Riviera that were, in the Gaza, that required the removal of population of Gaza, that there was a poll in Israel, and 80% of Israelis support. And I think maybe that was a kind of a dark fantasy that it could be done easily, but that most Israelis recognize it's not possible and it's not a reality for many reasons, not just logistically, but for moral reasons.
It's dangerous thinking, isn't it? It was a dangerous suggestion, and for him to even put that out there, it's just so irresponsible. So him coming into the picture at, I don't know, can we call it the worst possible time? How is that going to change things?
It unleashed an idea that suddenly became a conversation in coffee shops that wouldn't have happened a month ago. But having said that, his craziness and throwing things out there is forcing people to recognize the instability of the reality that's around them and the necessity of fresh thinking. Not fresh thinking for ethnic cleansing, but that the management of the conflict. Israelis, many centrist Israelis, many ordinary Israelis, certainly the Israeli establishment, had a view that the conflict could be managed. And in that sense, they could contain the negative impact of the occupation to Israelis in Israel, but also the external world risk of boycotts or disinvestment or sanctions, etc. That, in their view, was the kind of a long-term doable plan in the absence of something darker or the absence of something more positive. there is a sense that, managing the conflict just won't work. And in a way, that's a good thing that's becoming off the table. Now, the risk is there's two options, something darker and something far more positive. But the management of the conflict, which for Palestinians in the West Bank is brutal, and an occupation and a horrific way of living, increasingly, I think, is seen as not sustainable. Better ideas have to flood that so-called gap, There's a market for ideas, so to speak.
Now, what is really needed at this stage is some urban experts. So you're doing a doctorate at the moment on urban beauty at is it the Technion Haifa?
Yeah, the Technion Institute in Haifa, which is Israel's kind of premier institute for research. I'm doing a doctorate. I just submitted a doctorate on urban beauty, which is something that interested me hugely in Dublin. I'm working as an urban planner for 25 years or 20 years. How much money and how much investment was spent on the centre of Dublin. And I remember asking my colleagues, had we known that the economy during the Celtic Tiger was going to grow at 6.7% on average for 10 years, this number sticks in my head, 6.7% on average for 10 years, might we had expected a more beautiful inner city? And then people look at you and go, what do you even mean by beauty? And, the layperson understands what we mean by beauty, that it's beautiful, that it's livable, that there's no dereliction, that there's greater harmony in the landscape, you want to be there, etc. And the inner city remains challenging in Dublin. So that experience of working in Dublin for 25 years, I funneled or channeled it into this PhD and I just submitted it. So it became deeply ironic or, strange for me halfway through the process of writing about urban beauty. I start writing about urban destruction in Gaza. And for the last year, I'm writing, in the morning about the concept of urban beauty and what it means. And then the next day, I'm writing about the level of destruction in Gaza in the same place. The university is 80 kilometers north of Tel Aviv and Gaza 60 kilometers south. And it has been a weird experience to be writing about both things at the same time.
Wouldn't it be a lovely idea to focus everyone on creating beautiful places where we could all live and have beautiful neighbours that we could prosper together?
Indeed.
And you would think religious beliefs might even lend itself to that kind of thinking as opposed to the opposite. So, Paul, you're on the Win Happy podcast.
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying this conversation. I am thinking, in the name of God, what are you doing there? Get the hell out. I must admit. Finding happiness now every single day, despite everything that's going on. Are you happy? Can you be happy there?
It's a great question. You can, and you think about happiness in a way that I think most people ordinarily don't, because one, it's a challenge to live in a war zone where you have children, and then there's the guilt. Can I be happy? Can I swim in the sea every morning? Can I enjoy that? Can I be happy swimming in the sea, in 60 kilometers down the road in the same sea, what's happening in Gaza? And so, can a place be beautiful, Tel Aviv, knowing that it's the engine of the Israeli state and, what has happened in Gaza? From an academic point of view and kind of an intellectual point of view, these questions are in my head all the time. But from a personal point of view, can I be happy? Yeah, you can. And you have to try to be happy without closing your eyes. I think I said the last time I just had one child, now I have two. And, the source of fun and wonderment and joy and immediacy of a 2-year-old and an 8-year-old, and even how they communicate is the biggest, no disrespect to my partner, but it's the biggest happiness of all. So, am I happy? Am I allowed to say that I am? When you're living in an environment like this? But yeah.
Yeah. And in the same breath, are we allowed to be happy here and decide every day, let's ignore what we're seeing on CNN and news? It's easy to just, we get the shock and horror when all of these big things happen. Oh my God, October 7th and all the bombing in Gaza. And at a certain point, it gets saturated. And so many people say, I can't watch the news anymore. It's all dull and grim, and let's look out at the ocean down in West Cork and let's just enjoy what we have and let's turn a blind eye to everything else. You say, can you go for a swim and not feel guilty about it because 60 kilometres? Well, should we be enjoying our lives here and ignore everything else that's going on? I'm not sure. But what can we do? We're all rowing our boats and doing our best, I guess. But it would be beautiful if a lot of the focus in the world wouldn't be on hatred, and that it could be on urban beauty, living in beautiful places and having beautiful lives. What's wrong with that? Jesus. I wouldn't mind a bit more of that, Paul.
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, as I said, it might to listeners seem facile talking about urban beauty and the environment that we're living in, but the immediacy of our home environment, no matter where we are, is a huge component of our happiness. And yeah, there's realities and there's news consumption, and all of us have to, maybe in different places, limit that news consumption to keep sane, without censoring or without blocking out, truths. I think it's and finding that judgment in wherever you live. Obviously people have different responsibilities in West Cork than they have in Tel Aviv, but yeah, we all have to find that balance.
Yeah. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and giving us a perspective of what's going on over there. Thank you for being brave enough to put those words into writing on our national publications here. That's really useful, I think, for Irish people to understand that. And thank you, and hopefully we'll chat again.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for those kind words. I appreciate it.
See you again, Paul.
See you, Greg. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the When Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.